Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third session of the Silicon Valley Startup Forum hosted by KAIST College of the Business. I am Professor Dojun Lee, also came from the KAIST College of the Business, and I'll be the moderator of today's third session. We invited 10 distinguished speakers in the startup area and composed a total of the 10 sessions regarding the beginning and the development of startup. We hope that students and professors and alumni from KAIST will listen to lectures and gain insight from world-class scholars and experts on how they should design and grow startups. I will introduce today's speakers. We have invited Professor Steve Blank for today's session. Professor Blank created the customer development method that launched the lean startup movement, a methodology which recognizes that startups are not smaller versions of the large companies, but require their own set of the processes and the tools to be successful. His Lean Launchpad class has become the standard for commercialization for all federal research by the NSF. And the NSF trained 1,900 teams and launched more than 10,000 startups. His Hacking for Defense class has been adopted by the US Department of Defense. After I retired from the Samsung Electronics as a senior vice president, I attended the 2015 Lean Launchpad Educator class, and I met Steve there. He changed my life. After I learned the Lean Launchpad from him, I became a professor to teach Lean Launchpad in Korea. So now I'm teaching Lean Launchpad at KAIST from the 2018. That is why I invited Steve to this forum as a special guest. Today I will have a fire chat with Steve, and it is an honor to introduce Professor Steve Blank. Hi, Steve.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Can you introduce yourself briefly? I introduce you, but it will be better to you introduce yourself a little bit. Yeah.
You did such a good job. I'm not sure I could do better, but I did 8 startups in Silicon Valley in 20 years. And at the end of those 20 years, I had 4 IPOs, which was pretty good for startups. But I also had 2 very, very big and public failures. And actually, I learned more from the failures than I did from the successes. Because when you succeed, you think you're a genius. But when you fail, if you're honest, you have to discover what went wrong. And the lean startup came out of that. And then for the last 20 years, since I retired, I've been teaching at the business school at Berkeley and Columbia University, and now my home is inside the engineering school at Stanford University.
Okay, so we can start today's fire chatting. So I have some of the questions I have, so please give us your insight for that. So how did your startups get built when you are on the entrepreneur?
Yeah, so startups got built in a very different way than we build them now. In the 20th century, a founder would have an idea. They'd maybe talk some of their friends, and their friends would tell them it was a good idea. And then they would put together a PowerPoint deck and then try to raise money, saying, I have this good idea. I want to build this hardware or software or new computer. And if they were lucky, investors would like them or their presentation or their idea, and they would raise money. And the idea for the investors were, and here was, we kind of now think this is silly, but the investors basically treated the startups like they were smaller versions of large companies. That is, the investors asked and coached and taught the entrepreneurs to do everything a big company did. What do I mean by that? Well, our investors, would tell us, we want to see a 5-year plan. That is, we want to see all the revenue in a spreadsheet from now to 5 years. Even if the market was zero, we want to see a 5-year plan. And by the way, we want you on day one to hire just like the org chart of a large corporation. We want you to hire a VP of sales. We want you to hire a VP of marketing. Obviously, you need an engineering team. You also need probably a head of business development. And your engineering team will, in fact, take that list of features you promised us the investors, in your business plan. And by the way, you had to not only write the slides, you had to write a business plan. And that business plan talked about the team, the problem, the idea, but more importantly, specified the product you were going to build. And the investors, that's what they funded, was your idea in the plan and the slides. And so you hired engineers and an engineering team to build that product. Well, never once did anybody consider that maybe customers didn't care about your idea, but it didn't matter because you had raised this money and investors told you it was a good idea. So we'd build the product, we'd go through what was called alpha test, beta test, first customer ship. We'd use a waterfall or stage gate model, that is simply a step-by-step process of building the product in serial fashion. And then we'd have a party. By then we would hire a VP of marketing who would throw a big event, and we'd have a VP of sales who maybe just started to scale or hire more salespeople, and they would take the product, and it must be right because our investors gave us all this money, and try to sell the product. And most of the time, the customers would tell you, no, we're not interested. And so the next thing that would happen is maybe 6 months or a year later, while the company is burning cash, you would fire the first VP of sales because obviously they weren't any good because the product must be right. The VCs funded it. And then a year later, if it still wasn't selling, you'd fire the VP of marketing because the new VP of sales said it was a positioning problem. And then eventually you run out of money or you fire the founder or something else. By the way, every time you fired one of these executives, you changed the strategy. That is, in hindsight, the only time you had permission to change who the customers were or what the features were or what anything else was you fired people. And again, we look back at this now and thought, this is kind of ridiculous. So some of you might be listening and saying, no, this is still how we do startups. But mostly in Silicon Valley, we realized that this model was very wrong. And it was wrong because not only are startups not smaller versions of large companies, they're doing something early that large companies no longer do. That is, large corporations, Samsung, others, Facebook, are executing what's called the known business model, which is a fancy business school term for you know who your customers already are. You know what pricing they want. You know what features they want or what products they want. You know who your competitors are. You know all the distribution channels that work and those that don't. You know how to create demand. All those in a large company for your core business are known things. But in a startup, while you think you might know them because you wrote them down and your investors gave you money, most of them are just guesses or hypotheses, fancy word for guesses, assumptions. And so in a startup, what we discovered is that you need to treat them as things you need to figure out whether they're true or not. So let me stop there. That's how we used to do startups in the 20th century.
Okay. Then what do we now know that is different?
Right, and that's where I stopped. It was a great question. Well, the big idea was, remember I said large companies execute a known business model. We have all kinds of tools and processes and management techniques to manage processes and procedures in large companies. But here's the big idea. startups don't execute at all in their first year or so. Most startups are actually searching for a business model. That is, they're searching for who are the right customers, what's the right feature set, and that combination of customers and feature set is called product market fit. And they're searching for what's the right pricing, what's the right demand creation strategy, what's the right distribution channel. We're searching for all of these. In the past, we assumed if we wrote it down, it would be correct. Unfortunately, magic never happened. Unfortunately, most of the times our assumptions were wrong. Sometimes completely wrong, sometimes slightly wrong. But we had no mechanism, no machinery, no methodology to kind of test the assumptions. And so the big idea, my work, Eric Ries's work, Alexander Osterwalder's work, started to say, you know, we need our own tools to manage and grow a startup different than what large companies were using. And that method became called the lean startup. And maybe it's useful for me to describe those steps in the lean startup.
Yeah, sure. So what is the lean startup? So can you explain for that? Yeah.
Yes. So the lean startup is this methodology that startups use to find the truth, to find the facts behind those early assumptions. And it has three parts. One is the part I invented, which is pretty obvious if you think about it, which says, look, there are no facts inside your building, so get the heck outside. And what I mean about no facts is when you're a startup, you tend to talk to your co-founders and engineering folks and other employees about here's what we're going to build, and here's what we're going to do, and here's what we're going to whatever, and here's what the product should look like, without ever testing any of those assumptions outside the building. And I realized a couple things. One is you might be the smartest person in the building, but you're not smarter than the collective intelligence of your potential customers. So why don't we build a formal methodology to get outside your building, your office, your factory, and actually start talking to customers about what problems they have, what jobs they need to get done, and whether what you're building actually would fit. And often you discover that they really don't care about the top three features. It was actually number 5 that they would pay a lot of money for. Or you might discover these are the wrong customers. Or you might discover, oh, it's a multi-sided market, especially if you're selling inside a company. A B2B sale, business-to-business sale, is very different than a sale to consumers. Or you might have decided you're starting to sell to consumers and you realize the product's a lot more valuable to the enterprise. That is, you'll discover a lot of things if you actually test your assumptions as early as possible. And so customer development is a formal methodology to do that. And I wrote a book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany that kind of kicked off this conversation in the lean startup movement. That was part 1 of 3. The second part of lean is using a methodology to build the product different than the one we used before. If you remember, I said that in the 20th century, we built products a step at a time, and it was called a waterfall method, where it looks like you're going down a waterfall, where you would spec the product, engineering would turn it into a functional spec, then they create an alpha test, a beta test, and then you'd ship it. And the first time customers really got to use the product or even get feedback, not for engineering, but for whether they pay for it, is after you would ship it. And as I said before, that was a real mistake because most of the time you were wrong. Well, there's a different method now to build products called agile engineering. And agile engineering says, instead of building the whole product in step by step, why don't we build the product incrementally and iteratively? That is, why don't we build a wireframe first, or if it's a physical product, a cardboard mock-up, or kind of a demo of what it would look like. And as we're getting out of the building with customer development, we could take these, what are called, new idea, a minimum viable product. That is something that helps us test the product or pricing or channel or user interface or any part of the business model as early as possible and put it right in front of the customer. Not to sell, but to say, would this solve the problem I heard you tell me you had? And often people you might have talked to with customer development might have said, oh yes, if you could deliver this, we'd buy a lot of them. But the minute you put something in front of people or have them hold it or whatever, they'd say, oh, it weighs too much, or no, the interface should be green, or these buttons I don't like. And if you do that enough, you'll end up refining or adding more features to the minimum viable product, because back in the building, you're still engineering, and it won't be a bigger feature list. It will be the correct feature list. So by the time you ship the finished product, customers will grab it out of your hands. Now, the other thing about Lean that this allows you to do is change your mind. And if you remember my description of how startups worked in the 20th century, is investors believed that when they gave you money for your business plan, that plan wasn't going to change. Lean says completely the opposite. Lean says there's a very high probability when you start talking to customers and showing them your MVPs, you're going to need to change something or almost everything. You might need to change the feature set. You might need to change who your customers are. You might need to change the price or even the pricing strategy. Maybe it should be subscription, or maybe it should be a lease, or maybe you should change your channel, or you should change, instead of going B2C, B2B. Lean gives you permission to do this, and we give it a name. That permission is called pivot. A pivot allows you to change without getting fired. We kind of laugh about this now, but if someone would have come into your board meeting 30 years ago when I was an entrepreneur and says, we need to change who our customers are, people would have been, be looking at you like you're probably the wrong CEO. Instead, today, if you go, here's what we learned after talking to 75 customers, we found that people over here are more likely to buy than our original thoughts of these people. Your investors will think you're a genius. And so we now have permission using Lean to actually get out of the building, test some of our core ideas about the business model, and allowed to change as we actually interact with customers with a minimum viable product. So step one was customer development. Step two was agile engineering. And step three, and that's all there is to Lean, is 3 steps, is something called a business model canvas. And a business model canvas is a single piece of paper. Alexander Osterwalder wrote a great book called Business Model Generation that describes this. And it basically lists the 9 things that most startups need to worry about. It's not a complete list, but boy, it's pretty good to have on one piece of paper. And it allows you, which is why I like the canvas, to simply list all your assumptions that you're going to test outside the building. What are those assumptions? Well, number one, who are the customers? Are the customers, in large corporations? If so, what's their title? What do they do? And by the way, you might have a multi-sided market, meaning there might be users and payers and saboteurs and other types of people, or there might be consumers. The second part that you need to worry about is, what are you building for those customers? Are you building a product, a service? What is it? And more importantly, how does each one of the features you're building match a job to be done, that is a problem or something one of those customers will tell you not only they need, but they'll pay for, or they'll use a lot or something. And so what you're looking for is this product market fit from those customers to your product. The third thing on that canvas is your distribution channel. How will you reach customers? Is it with a direct sales force? Is it through an app store, etc.? The fourth thing is, how do you create demand? That is, how do you get customers? How do you keep them and grow them? Customer relationships. That is, am I using the web and spending Google ad dollars? Am I buying, ads in a print media? Am I using television and something else? And then what's my revenue stream and what's my revenue strategy? And what's my pricing? Pricing is how much does it cost? But a revenue strategy could say, I'm doing this via subscription, or there's a freemium model, or there's a direct sales, or I'm selling through OEM. And then there's another side of the canvas that says, what are the core activities I need to be expert at? If I'm building some hardware, am I using a third-party manufacturer? If I'm building silicon, am I using a Samsung foundry, for example? Or am I going to set up my own chip fab thing? Probably not. But so what is it that I need to be expert at? Or if I'm building a software company that uses AI, obviously I need AI experts. But sometimes you forget is that you have this idea, but you forget that you need to list what are the critical activities then in the next year, 2, 3, that your company needs to be expert at. And then underneath that box is the resources your company needs to own personally. Do those engineers need to work for you, or can you use third party? Well, you're probably not going to build a fab, but you might want an expert who knows how to do design engineering and interface with the fab. Or you probably will want to have a couple of key AI architects. If that's your business, you might use third parties to build some of the rest of the software, but that core talent needs to be a resource. And then the other part of around activities is, well, what are the things you could outsource? That is, what are partners? And as I was using chips as an analogy, you're probably not going to build a fab, but there are partners like Samsung or others that might be good chip foundries for you. That's a partner. Well, what are partners to a startup? Those are people who provide resources early on that you physically or through lack of capital or just doesn't make sense to build yourself. And then the last part of the canvas is the cost. What's the cost of running your business? What are the fixed costs? What are the variable costs? And those are the things overall as a startup on day one, you don't have any idea. You have a set of guesses. If you are a large company, you'd be able to write out all the facts inside those canvases. As a startup, you use little yellow sticky notes saying, here's my guesses about all these things. Remember, the first two that mattered are customers and the product features and the jobs to be done. But the rest of the business model matters as well. And so you're using customer development and agile engineering to test all these hypotheses as quickly as you can. So with that, that's the lean startup in a single conversation. You got the entire semester's class in about 15 minutes. There is one thing to note, though, is when you're getting out of the building, a real trap, a real problem could occur. And that is thinking that you need to take everybody's opinion as a feature request and run back into your company and tell your engineering partners, oh, people said we need X, so I just did customer development and therefore we need this feature. That's wrong. Your goal, hopefully if you're the founder doing this, and we'll talk about that in a second, is to in fact do all this outside the building activity to inform your vision. You have a vision on day one about what the product is, who the customers are, etc. This on a perfect day, just simply validate everything you know. And in reality, what it'll do is educate you about what you kind of should probably move to as you get smarter. But as you get smarter, the goal is not to make the feature list longer. The goal is to make the feature list shorter. Is what is it that people have told me are the essential, just incredibly important things I need to ship on day one that they'll pay for, and what could be in later releases, or what doesn't matter at all. So that's the lean startup in about 15 minutes.
Wow, that's really nice. Condense the concept for the lean startups. Thanks. And then what is the business model? And why do I care about the business models? Right.
So as I said, the business model canvas and the business model is kind of the totality, the sum of all the parts of your business. As an entrepreneur and a technical entrepreneur, I first used to think that, well, the business is all about my idea, and then I used to think, well, it's all about my technology. And I used to think the company, well, I got a little smarter. No, it's all about my product. Well, I have to tell you, for those of you who've done startups, you already know this, that you could have the world's best technology and go out of business. You could certainly have the world's best idea and go out of business. And you could even have the best product go out of business if it doesn't make money, or if it's the wrong, it's the wrong channel or wrong customers, etc. The business model is all the pieces necessary to take your great idea and turn it into a profitable company that could grow at scale. And so when I talked about all the parts of, you need to understand key activities, you need to understand distribution channel, you need to understand, customer relationships, keeping and growing customers. How do you do that? All those things are the moving parts that turn an idea and a product into a profitable big company. And understanding that distinction of, it's not just my tech, or not even just a good product, though you need a good product to make that happen, is what a business model describes.
Okay. Then can you explain a little bit more about your customer development? What is the customer development process?
Right. So customer development has a set of steps. Step one is you get out of the building and you do in fact, the steps are, customer discovery, customer validation, company creation, and scale. And I'll talk about the first two steps because that's what a startup does in its first year or two. So customer discovery is getting out of the building and talking to potential customers, regulators, or stakeholders, or anybody else involved in your business model who you might think of might be involved. To defer, do they have a problem you believe they have? You might want to think about this for a second, is that as you're building your own product or service, you believe people will use it because they have some problem. What is that problem? Write that down. Your first step in customer discovery is to get out of the building and test what other people share your problem. And not only do they share your problem, how important is that problem to them? The next step in customer discovery, in customer development, is once you found people who said, yes, this is important, or maybe these features are more important than others, is to validate the problem. And if you remember, I talked about using minimum viable products, iterative and incremental product development. You use an MVP, a minimum viable product, to validate what you've learned in customer discovery. Is, gee, I heard you say your problem was this, or that you needed this. If it looked something like this, if this wireframe or this hardware, even though I understand it's messy, if we could actually build this at scale or at this price, would you buy it? And what you're looking for at the end of customer validation is people you and grab that out of your hands. And you go, well, it's not finished. So no, I need that right now. That's what you're looking for. You're looking for people's eyes get big and their heart rate goes up and they go, I've been waiting for this my whole life. And so customer development is not something that could be done inside your building. You would never get that feedback. All you would have is a belief that that was the case, but no facts. And so if you remember, the core of customer development is there are no facts inside your building, and get outside. That's what the customer development process does. And the front end of that, as part of this discovery, is understanding deep down what job does the customer want to get done. That is, the most famous example from Clayton Christensen Harvard professor who came up with the whole idea of the innovator's dilemma and disruption, is that even though people sell drills, there are companies that sell drills that make holes. While some people want to buy a drill, most people don't want the drill. Most people want the hole. That is, I want to make a hole, not I want to own a drill. The job to be done is actually making holes in walls or wood or something else. The device, the solution, is the drill. The job to be done is making holes. It'd be interesting to think about it. No one's using Facebook. People are using social media to be entertained. The solution is Facebook or TikTok or something else. The job to be done is entertainment when I'm bored or connection with other people. So that's customer development kind of in a nutshell. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Okay. Then the next question is, how do I know if I have validated my business model hypothesis?
Well, that's kind of easy because the good news is customers will start grabbing the unfinished product or service out of your hands. When you tell them how much it costs, they'll say, when can I get it? And you want a sufficient number of those answers, not one person, but it depends on the market. If you're selling expensive enterprise software, some number between 2 and 20 is good enough if you are finding repeatable answers to the same product. That is, you don't have to change the slides. And by the way, another test is if your slide deck isn't changing every other day, and you're getting a positive response, you might have found product market fit. But what you're looking for is this fit between product and customers such that they reach over the table and say, I want this now. If you don't have that, don't fool yourself. Don't say, well, I had to give them a 60% discount, or I had to, give it away and maybe they'll buy it later. Maybe, but you really haven't found deep customer demand. Now, those same small numbers of enterprise sales are obviously different on the web. If you only have 5 or 20 people using your website, you really haven't found product market fit. The number should probably be thousands, and it should be scaling exponentially. What you're looking for is if I add an increment of a salesperson or a marketing person, can I multiply sales by n times that unit? That is, the sales increase exponentially, and does it happen automatically because I've completely matched what my product, what the messaging, what the positioning and the pricing is, and the channel to what those customers need? These are not separate things. You're looking for the right customers and trying to understand what they need and building something so it's so obvious to them when they either see it or they use it or you demo it or they download it that they go, this is it. It's either addictive or it solves the problem I have and I got to have it. And you've made it easy to buy at a reasonable price through channels that they could that are accessible to them. So that's how kind of is that you start seeing sales kind of scale. The worst thing that happens, by the way, is you get kind of used to early sales that look like this and continue on flat or maybe grow 10% a year. Outside of life sciences, there is no such thing as a 7-year startup, a 7-year-old startup. There's a 2-year-old startup attached to a 5-year-old failure. What you're looking for is exponential scale and growth. And sometimes it takes a while to find product market fit, but when it does, it should kind of feel like this. Or else you end up in what I call the land of the living dead, meaning you don't want to be here, you're still alive, but it's probably not worth being in that company because growth is kind of minimal.
Okay, so the next one is what is the best way to seek funding for my ventures, my startups?
Go ask people. Uh, let me be clear. I'm not familiar with the Korean venture capital environment, but in the U.S., usually it's through some reference. Still, it's usually that someone mentioned you to a VC. Most often, at least when I was an entrepreneur, knocking on the front door, they don't know you, they don't know, who you are. Not, at least here in the U.S., it's not what school you went to. Though Stanford and Harvard still sometimes go to the front of the line, and it's not who your family is or what school it's more of, did somebody tell a VC, you got to see this company, they have a great idea that's going to make a lot of money. Remember, and in fact, let me remind entrepreneurs, venture capitalists are not giving you a gift. They're not even giving you a loan. They want to make an obscene return on their money. They're going to look at hundreds of deals before they'll invest in you. And what they're looking for is an outrageous return that's only possible if you're a company whose sales eventually will go like this. And so what they're looking for is the match to a company that has the right team, has the right product, has identified the right customers, and depending where you are in funding, whether you're doing pre-seed round or a seed round or a Series A or B, it matches the characteristics of what those VCs are looking for. So I guess number one is through a reference, and the time to figure that out is not the day you need money. So before you even start your company, you need to start your network. And by network, I mean, if these are the types of investors you want to go after, then you're going to have to figure out, who do I know who went to school with them or know them, or are there other startups that got money from them, or people they respect, etc., who could send them an email that says, hey, you ought to look at, so-and-so's company. I think it's really going to be successful. The second thing about VCs that you should remember is, I keep talking about they're looking for growth that looks like exponential curve. They're not funding restaurants or grocery stores or individual, entrepreneurs. And so, at least in the United States, I have a lot of students confused about what we call small businesses, which could be very profitable, versus venture scale businesses, which are obscenely profitable, meaning they make so much money like Uber or Facebook or whatever. That's what investors, professional venture capital investors, are looking for. And so you might have a great idea that might make you $1 million or $2 million a year, or even $5 or whatever, and you can't understand why VCs don't want to talk to you, because they're not looking for something, believe it or not, that's small. They're looking for something at scale that address markets that are billions of dollars, or could create markets that can create corporate value of billions of dollars. If you can't convince people you're in that market and actually convince yourself, then you're going to find a hard time finding venture capitalists returning your calls.
Okay, I think that's a great advice. Okay, now next one.
And by the way, there's one other suggestion I will make, and this took me a long time to understand. Most founders of companies now could describe how startups work and their industries, and if they're very smart, they'll understand this lean startup process and customer development. But very few people, maybe more now than ever, but very few could go up to a whiteboard and describe, how does a venture capitalist make money? That's a big idea. Because the minute you take money from someone, their business model, that is how they make money, now becomes yours. That is, you think you're still operating your business model. Well, they gave you money, so their business model becomes effective. Well, how is it they make money? Where do they get money from? What kind of returns are their investors looking for? How many of the things they invest in succeed? And how much of your company do they need to own, even if it was worth $1 billion, for it to be worthwhile for them to give you $1 million, $5 million, $10 million? And so if you want to be a a really successful entrepreneur, you need to not only know how VCs think, but you need to know how they make money themselves. And this isn't a secret. Though when I was an entrepreneur, no one talked about this. It was worth talking about how VCs, and I don't mean how they get paid, though that's also now public. They, typical model for VC is called the 2 and 20. They take 2% management fee and 20% carry, and there are other models now, but it's basically how do they make money on each fund? So I train my entrepreneurs, my founders, to kind of understand that before they go out there with their hand saying, "Give me some money."
Okay, yeah, I think that's a great advice for the entrepreneurs who is seeking for the VC money, not for the bank. I think.
Yes.
Okay, and how do you think, how is entrepreneurship changing it from the last 30 years?
Well, it's changed dramatically. The name is still the same, and entrepreneur, and VCs are still called VCs. But if you're a venture-funded company, number one, the idea of being able to take money out of your company, that is, get more than just a very poor salary, never existed when I was an entrepreneur. Now, at least here in the United States, if you're a very successful startup, you're allowed to sell some of your stock at each round, at each fundraising round, and take money and put it in the bank. That was unheard of as an entrepreneur. Plus your salary. I mean, I worked for enough salary to feed my family with noodles and ramen. And nowadays the salary for startup founders are just immense. Not as much as in a corporation, but certainly livable. The second part, which is great for Korean entrepreneurs, is if you wanted to get funded, at least by U.S. Venture capitalists, you had to physically move to one of the innovation centers in the United States. Number one, Silicon Valley, and for a while, Boston for life sciences, San Diego for life sciences, and then New York, and now L.A. But in the last, certainly 15 years, entrepreneurship is now everywhere. And what's really interesting is risk capital, venture capital is now everywhere. And here's what happened is, at the turn of the 21st century, entrepreneurship became everywhere because all the secrets, which weren't secrets, but kind of domain knowledge of how to build startups, everybody started putting it on the web. It used to be when I was an entrepreneur, you had to have coffee with someone physically who knew how to do this. And again, those were limited locations in the world, even very limited in the United States. The internet changed all that. The second part that changed was the emergence of Amazon Web Services. It used to be if you were building software, you'd have to spend several $1 million buying a computer that you would put in your own company and have terminals that engineers would write software on. Now that looks ancient. It is ancient. Now computing is a utility like electricity. We buy computing, and if we need more, we just pay a little more, and it's a service. And by the way, the same thing is true for hardware. When I did my first chip company, we had to have our own fabs. And by my second chip company, we had a second source. But boy, it was like there was no such notion of a foundry. And of course, today, if you want to manufacture hardware, you might build a factory for some stuff, but typically you outsource a ton of it. So this ability to outsource. And for venture capital, what this means is, entrepreneurs are now everywhere, but it used to be that venture capital was still limited to a certain number of cities around the world, though in the last 20 years, that's exploded. I mean, Pearl River Valley in China, around Seoul, northwest Beijing, Herzliya near Tel Aviv, multiple places in the U.S., London before Brexit, other places in Europe. There's probably now 20 or 30 places in the world you could raise $100 million, where before there might have been 2. The third thing is that COVID has changed the nature of innovation and entrepreneurship, at least outside of China. And I'm not sure in Korea, but certainly in the United States, we'll now hire engineers anywhere in the world. they no longer physically need to be in that cluster. And the big thing is VCs will now fund companies outside of clusters. They no longer physically need to be there. And venture capitalists, I know, were writing seed round checks of several $1 million without ever physically meeting the entrepreneurs. They could be anywhere. That was just barely, almost never done when I was an entrepreneur. So entrepreneurship has gotten global. Risk capital, at least for very early stages, has gotten global. They still have to be in certain areas to raise, 8, 9, 10 digits of capital, but it's changed, and I think changed for the better. Though I think we'll see kind of a science experiment between the U.S. and China, and maybe China and the rest of the world, about the difference about still having a physical cluster where you meet for innovation versus having it distributed, which COVID has forced us to do. So that's my answer.
Okay. And then what does the future of the startups looks like, do you think? What is it going to be?
If I knew that, I would be a hedge fund investor. But I think the future is bright. I mean, the fact that I'm having this conversation with entrepreneurs in Korea just makes the point that entrepreneurship is now global. It's scaling. The problems we need to solve are not only social media problems or making more chips, but they're climate problems, oceans problems, social problems, that entrepreneurship is perfectly well suited to solve. For me, the closest thing to a founder, not just an early stage employee, but a founder, is an artist. Artists see things that other people don't. They hear things that other people don't. And while everybody else says, no, that's not possible, or you can't do that, or the rules don't allow us to do that, entrepreneurs go, I don't care, I'm going to do that anyway. Entrepreneurs are the ones that make the world go round, and in fact, push the future forward. They're the ones that make lives worth living and make them better. And now is, I think, the best time in the world to be a founder, and certainly an entrepreneur is, I think all societies, all countries have understood that this is different than building a large company or working in a large company, and you don't have to apologize to your parents anymore why you're not going to work for a big company or the bank or the government, as they understand that it's quite possible to build a successful career as an entrepreneur. And probably the last part is there's more money available worldwide, locally, etc., to entrepreneurs than there ever were in the history of entrepreneurship. It's a great time. I can't imagine a better time. I'm jealous for all of you listening and watching. This is the golden age of entrepreneurship. So grab the opportunity and make it happen.
Okay. I have some more questions. I think the last 20 years, you changed a lot in the United States. You bring up this customer development process and the Lean Launchpad, and nowadays NSF is accepted Lean Launchpad, the methodology for the funding the scientists. So can you tell us about how NSF accepted your Lean Launchpad and applied to the government, the research process, and the supporting those entrepreneurs? It's not really happening in Korea. Yeah.
Well, I can't speak about Korea, but I could tell you what happened at the NSF is that about 40 years ago in the United States, our government decided that it was valuable to fund scientists for basic research, or maybe 75 years ago when we set up our National Science Foundation and set up our National Institute of Health and set up NASA. That is, our government funds an enormous amount of basic science research. And about 30, maybe 40 years ago, it realized that some of those basic scientific research topics some of them could turn into companies or products and services. That is not just basic science, but applied science. And so the government and our Congress said, well, why don't we set up a program to fund them? And that program was called the SBIR program, Small Business Something Research Grants. And we would give scientists who wanted to start a company money to go take your basic research and fund it. And for 30 years, that went on. We would fund these scientists who wanted to start companies. The bad news is most of them failed. And every director of the NSF would ask, well, why were they failing? What could we do better? And they ran different experiments. They first tried to teach them how to be MBAs, and then they try to, bring MBAs in, and then they try to take all the tools that were known that large companies used. But finally, when someone at the NSF saw my work on the lean startup, they said, in fact, this is what they said in the phone call. You've just discovered the scientific method for entrepreneurship. And I said, what do you mean? He said, Steve, hypothesis testing, that is testing your assumptions, that's the core of the scientific method. You've basically taken entrepreneurship away from spreadsheets and business plans and slides and said, we're just going to treat this like a set of hypotheses. And scientists know that language. They could understand that. And the NSF could understand that. And so what we basically built was a program called I-Core for the Innovation Core that's now in 100 universities 10 years later. And we built a version for not only the NSF, but for our National Institute of Health, which is still going on in 2 of the divisions. We built a version for our National Security Agency, which is across our intelligence community, our energy department. And then we built another version of this called Hacking for Defense, where instead of scientists working or students working on their own problems, we actually took problems from our military and gave them to students to work on with the exact same methods. And that's now in 50 universities, both in the US, in the UK, and in Australia. And so the method kind of really appealed, back to your question, for the National Science Foundation. Hypothesis testing is core. It's what the scientific method is about. And so the idea was to teach scientists that the building a company was more than just their technical idea, that it had all these other components that we were going to directly expose them to. And we did, and it's been successful.
Yeah, I think that changed the whole thing, for the United States. So how many universities now teaching Lean Launchpad class in the United States?
So the Lean Launchpad class, I'd say a couple of hundred. I've lost count. I trained educators on how to do this. I open sourced all the material. My books have been translated into multiple languages, including Korean. And so, if you're a student of entrepreneurship, or if you're an entrepreneur in the U.S., the odds are you and your investors have heard of this method, and your investors are either asking you about it or you're practicing it. And so it has replaced mostly how to write a business plan. When I started teaching, that was how to write a business plan was kind of the top class that you would take, what's called the capstone class, the class on top. And even when I started teaching it as an entrepreneur, I realized, well, they make you write the business plan, but no one actually reads them. And so we should be teaching this in the English department, not in the engineering school. And the lean startup classes kind of have replaced how to write a business plan now at most universities.
Okay. And then how about this, I think normally you started from the engineering school, and then I think in the Berkeley you started from the business school. But how many majors the university taking this Lean Launchpad classes?
I can't think of any major that hasn't taken the class. At Stanford and Berkeley, at least where I teach, the class is open to all departments because we make the students form a team. It's not just one student working on a project. They usually have teams of 4 and 5. And a successful team, just like a successful startup, has people from different backgrounds, whether they're engineers or MBAs or people from the medical school with a medical device or a diagnostic or a therapeutic they want to test. So these are combination teams across the university. And I found it works, for anybody interested in learning how to commercialize an idea.
Okay, so you teach the Stanford and the Berkeley and the Columbia, and how many teams became really successful out of your class?
I've lost track. To be honest, I think the more interesting question is how many professors have become really successful. I mean, it's like there have been a lot of people who I don't teach this myself now. Even at Stanford, we just had a meeting of all the instructors, and there must be 10 people who teach this class, or some. The class became so popular we had to split the class, and now there are versions of the class, and even at Stanford it's kind of oversold. But we've had lots of interesting startups. I don't even keep track anymore, to be honest.
Okay. And I think this is my last questions before we go into the Q&A. So if you give your founders one piece of advice, what would it be?
Get out of the building.
Get out of the building. Okay. That's it.
That's it.
Okay.
I could go on for about an hour, but truly, founders are driven by passion and vision and whatever, and it's really hard to this simple thing of get out and test your idea is one of the hardest things you're going to do. Because you're excited, you think you know the answer, and you want to build this now, and absolutely go do that. But just test some of the assumptions. That's the hardest thing to do as a founder.
Okay, Steve. I met you in 2015, and I listened to your lectures at that time, and it's been almost more than 6 years. But still, your lectures and your insight is very helpful for us and then for our audience. So I think some questionnaires is waiting for the 1 hour to ask you a question. Is that Mr. Kim Min-jun? Are you there? Okay. So I think he takes some time. So I will start the Q&A, which I got previously. I got some questions from the students and professors. What is the most important thing in preparing a startup? What do you think?
Team. So, a startup is a long and difficult journey. And making sure you're on the journey with the right people is very important. I was lucky enough to do the 4 startups with 4 of my 8 startups with the same team members, and we had complementary skills, and we're able to trust each other's not just financially, but each other's commitment, work ethic, etc. And our visions were aligned. I'd say team is probably the most important part for me. There's all kinds of personal characteristics for founders, which are curiosity, agility, resilience, which is that is the ability to get up after you've been knocked down. Tenacity, the ability to stick to something. Agility, which is all about lean, being able to say, well, I thought I was going to do this, but perhaps this makes sense. So all these kind of add up. But for me, if you had to pick one, it's finding a great team to do it with. I see Mun-jun here.
Yeah, I think that the most of people say a team is very important. But most of the founders having a difficulty is how to make a team.
Well, how to make a team is like how to make a wife or a husband. You have to date. You have to go out and meet people and whether they're in university or whether they're in meetups, whether they're whatever. It's just like dating. You need to try on some relationships, figure out whether people share your interests, whether they share how hard you work, etc. All these are important, but it is just like dating. You wouldn't assume that you're going to get married tomorrow, not having met anybody or gone out. The same thing with founders. And by the way, if you have a hard time dating, you're going to have a hard time finding founders.
So is that means it's like the starting a startups? I mean, the team is very important, right? Without team,
Yes.
it's, the success is not going to be happen. So that means
it's harder.
You have ideas, but you have to try to finding the teams. So that means after you have ideas, still you need some time to finding the people to working together.
Yes. So if you think about what a founder needs to do, at least the original founder, you need to convince lots of people. You not only need to convince other people to quit their jobs to join you, you need to convince investors to give you money when all you have are slides. You need to convince customers to give you money and try your product when all you have is buggy, unfinished software or hardware. If you don't have those communication skills and that ability to be convincing, it's going to be pretty hard. And it doesn't mean you need to have them on day one, but you need to recognize that you need to be able to do these things over time. And those are skills you could learn. You could learn how to give talks. You could learn how to be convincing. You could learn how to be, eloquent. But you need to understand. You need to know how to do that, not only to build a team, but to raise money and to get customers.
Yeah, so I mean, what problem I saw in Korea is the people has ideas and then they apply for the government and they got funded and they started a company. So I think they start the company too quickly. That's
Yes.
what I'm thinking. Yeah. So
Yes.
if you want to give them the advice, what kind of thing is going to be? Yeah.
Don't take money from the government until you've actually gotten out of the building.
Yeah, that's right. I think you need a team and you have to get convinced a lot of people. Then you should start the company, right?
Well, by the way, the other one is if I was giving advice to the government is don't give out money until there's some evidence that they've actually gotten out of the building and tested whether anybody cared about this idea. And maybe if I was really giving them advice, I would say, why don't we set up a I-Corps in Korea to model what the National Science Foundation did in the United States. It's worked, made much better companies out of technology.
Thank you for that comment. Okay, so I think Mr. Kim Min-jun is ready for the asking questions. Mr. Kim?
Yep, hello.
Go ahead.
Hi.
Oh, sorry for the confusion. And yeah, I'm Min-jun Kim, currently an undergraduate in KAIST. And I don't know if you received the pre-question list. And I mean, have you seen it? The questions?
No, you go ahead and ask.
All right, so it's truly an honor to see you. Like, Lean Startups is like a Bible for startups, right? And I've read all your articles and stuff, and it's truly an honor. And so the concept of minimum viable product is fascinating indeed. And in terms of continuously testing and improving the service, we're currently creating a social networking app designated for public transportation. And basically, it is a metaverse-based utility app designed to designated to public transportation. And the main functions include location-based real-time metaverse platform for users in the same public transportation, optimized map for daily commuting, community with interest.
But that's a feature list. What problem are you solving it for who?
So the two main problems are.
Do you understand the difference? You immediately went into the features.
Yep.
Yeah. Right?
I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I think it's a great example for everybody. Is because that's what I used to do all the time. Let me tell you how cool this is. Well, you go, well, that's great, but who cares and why?
So the main problem we're looking for is that although there are a lot of contents on social media like YouTube and Instagram, people get bored, and especially on public transportation where people are required to take because of commuting or going to school and etc. People are looking the same stuff over and over, and it gets repetitive. That's one main problem. And second main problem is that it's like taking the public transportation is really inconvenient, and people want like basically better experience in public transportation, and that's why.
Well, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good start. And so you believe that people want to be entertained in as they do public transit, and it's the experience is currently crummy.
Yep.
Okay, and you have some ideas on how to solve that problem.
Yep.
Okay? By the way, who's the customer?
Main customers are students and workers in their 20s to 30s.
How about the people who run the public transport? Are they a customer? Do you need their approval? You don't need their approval? You don't need them to do anything?
Not really.
Great. Okay.
I mean, we're getting an API from this for the subway notification, but then it doesn't really need an approval. It's open source.
Great. Perfect. Now that I understand what you're doing, what's the question? It's a great idea. What's the question?
The question is that we're trying to run a beta testing, and if we were to run a beta test for our app as our MVP testing, what is the optimal time length for testing? Like, I know we have to go out and get there, like do the testing, MVPs and all stuff, but what's the optimal length for testing?
Well, given the problem you just described is, you could be testing multiple things. There's not just one MVP. For example, how long is a commute that you want to solve? Is it 5 minutes or 50 minutes in Seoul, for example?
More than 30 minutes. Great.
So can you entertain someone just sitting in a room for 30 minutes? They don't even have to be on public transit, right? Mm-hmm. That is, there are different ways to break down parts of what you want to test rather than we need to do this on a train with the full product with whatever. You could also say, well, we'll not only do it in a room, let's use an iPad, to test. So do you see what I'm doing? It's which piece do we want to test before we have to build the whole thing or a de-featured version on the whole thing. Let's break down what do we think are going to be some barriers to adoption. Does that help or not? And then you'll figure out the time thing. It's like, oh, wait a minute, they still didn't like it. Well, was that because they were not on a train or whatever? Well, let's sit them on a train with an iPad and try this out. Or, gee, let's try it out here. And so what you're looking for in the answer to your time question is not just time, but what you want to see is where do lots of people, not just one or two or whatever. It's actually time and volume here. When do lots of people want to grab this out? And by the way, I still like the idea of a net promoter score, which is like, will they call up their friends to tell them? That is, if you have to use your reputation to reference somebody to say, boy, you got to try this, and they're not getting money for that, that's like, then you got something going on here. Does that answer your question? Good for you. Are you undergrad, you said?
Yeah, I'm an undergrad.
You're on your way. You're on your way, my friend. This is going to be good.
Is it okay if I ask you like a couple more questions? Or
I don't know. Let's ask our moderator.
Yeah, the make it short. Yeah.
Short.
Make it short. All right.
Because my answers are long.
So, like, one big question we want to solve is that how do you generate useful metrics that can appeal to the potential investors through MVP testing?
Well, I think the first one is you got to decide is how are you monetizing this thing, right? I mean, so there are the usual metrics of, how many people using it, average growth rate, time on, if the commute is 30 minutes, are they using it for 30 minutes or they use it for 3? How many of them are repeat visitors? How many times a week? That is, if they commute every day, or are they using it every day? But the other ones that people are going to start asking you are, do you have a monetization strategy? That is, how are you going to make money off of these people? Is it ads? Is it, is it a multi-sided market, etc.? Is it based on clicks inside the metaverse thing? And my suggestion is come up with a set of basic metrics of what you think they are. And then when you present to your first investor, or even, I don't know if they do coffees in Korea before formal pitches, go say, here are our metrics. What do you guys use? And they might give you a whole nother set of social media metrics, but at least come in with some of the obvious. Is like, okay, if people commute 5 days a week for 30 minutes, how many minutes a week are they using this thing, and what's the scale look like, and is there viral adoption, etc. I think there's some just basic ones, but I would ask, because investors have gotten experience now on social media, and they will have their own numbers and own scale that sometimes when I hear them, I'd be like, oh, if you don't have 10 million users, it's not even worth talking to you. It's like, my head explodes. You go, well, I got 100. No, I need to see 10 million or something. But does that make sense? All right. That was a short question and almost a short answer.
Thank you so much.
All right. Now it's going to be great.
Okay. Thanks for the questions. Okay, the next one is what do you think are the major problems urban air mobility startups business model?
What are your problems? And I'm sorry, I lost the last.
Oh no, the guy is I think he's doing the urban air mobility startups. So his question is, what is the major problems? I mean, why the urban air mobility startup is not flying? Probably that's probably his questions.
You mean, why do we have 140 characters and not flying cars? I think that's that's the question. Air mobility startups really are a technology in search of a market. And it doesn't mean they're not going to happen, but they're not going to happen, I don't think, in the way people are first thinking about. They might happen first for military special forces, might be actually the first customers. Then they might happen in specialized commute corridors, from tops of office buildings to remote areas. I think there's just a question about whether these things are large enough to make money. Whether the regulatory constraints are too hard for them to kind of succeed in. I think eventually someone will find the right product market fit, but right now it's the product in search of the customer and in search of the rest of the market. I've seen a lot of them in Silicon Valley and a lot of them working with our Defense Department. And it's this funny combination of trying to figure out payload and profitability and regulatory issues and scale that I don't think is here yet. But someone will figure it out. Okay. Did I answer the right question?
No, I mean, I got the answer, the question from the YouTube live, so I cannot hear his questions. Probably he can answer in the YouTube. Okay.
Well, then it was 100% the right answer.
Okay. Okay. Next one is as a Korean students or as a Korean the entrepreneur, what would be the fastest way to get to Silicon Valley and do an actual startup?
By airplane.
Yeah, I think so too. He just wanted to find it out how to start a company in the Silicon Valley in the fastest way. Probably that is his questions.
It's the same way I got there. At least in the United States, I was only half joking about the airplane. I got to Silicon Valley by getting in my car and just showing up. In every part of Silicon Valley is almost like a help group for entrepreneurs from different countries. There are Israeli entrepreneurs groups. There are Chinese. There's Russian entrepreneurship groups. I'm sure somewhere in Silicon Valley is a Korean group that will help you connect and get settled. People tend to start and find other people and then network. And so before I would get out to the Valley, I would find a couple of Korean entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who could kind of teach you some of the cultural differences of fundraising and entrepreneurship and help you find a very expensive place to live. But most of it is just physically making the leap. And to be honest, it was a lot easier for me to do it when I was single, didn't have a family, didn't own a house, and it was just very easy to kind of pick up from where I lived and go to this part of the United States.
Okay. Next one is probably you already talked about in our fireside chatting it. What is the most effective method to find the product market fit?
Yeah, well, the lean startup is certainly the most effective I know. But I just want your entire audience to hear, it's not the method. It's a method. It's a method that a lot of people have done, seems to make a lot of sense. It's not the right answer. It's a right answer. Nowadays with lots of money being thrown at startups, you could throw out the lean startup and just, make lots of mistakes and the money will make up for it. But so far, this seems to be the best, and I'm surprised, to be honest. It turned out not to be a fad and not to be temporary. It turned out to have some fundamental truths behind it, that startups were different than large companies, that probably you should talk to lots of people besides yourself and your co-founder. I mean, some of these are just fundamentally true, and that the method, I just want to remind everybody, is not a religion. It's kind of a set of best practices put together that are guides for you building your company.
Okay, I think this is the following the questions. Why lean startup is trending now? Why? Why do you think?
It's been, depends where you are in the world. It's been trending for 20 years where I've been. I just find it, as I said, I found it surprising that it has lasted as long as it has, because it has some fundamental truths that are effective in building successful companies. And it's not that, I just want everybody to hear this. It's not if you don't use lean, you won't be successful. It's just that this one is kind of a method. And it doesn't predict that you're going to be successful. It does kind of have some pretty good correlation about how much money and time you will spend and resources figuring out product market fit. But I think it's a pretty good end-to-end process. I think it's just being adopted all over because, after people who, here's a reason why you're hearing about it more, is that the first time you do a startup, at least for me, I didn't think I needed anybody's advice. Method, nah. Get out of the building, nah, bad idea. But after you've done one startup and failed, you then go back and think, maybe having a process was probably a good idea. And so what I think is the world is getting a lot more experience with a lot more people have become first-time entrepreneurs and have the advice and experience of what happens if you don't get out of the building and talk to people. Because then they will tell you the stories of, gee, I wish I would have found this out earlier, but it cost me all this money. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so I have one question from the YouTube. I think his question is he has some problem with the co-founders or co-workers. They have some
happens all the time.
Yeah, so he's asking what will be the best way to solving these issues.
So, having problems with co-founders is exactly, I'll go back to this relationship thing, like dating and marriage. You're spending all this time with your co-founders, with people you're working with 24/7, and it's not surprising that different people have different ideas about what to build, how to build it, etc. Sometimes it requires getting somebody inside, or getting somebody from the outside, either a board member or an advisor you both trust, to kind of listen to both of you and take you to dinner and help you talk out the problems. It's almost like therapy, which it is can we talk about our problems? Sometimes it requires one of you to leave. If you just disagree, the outcome is to tear apart the company like a divorce, or to figure out, no, you take it and I'll go elsewhere. So there's never any right answer. But the first is, I would suggest, is getting a third party in to take you both out to dinner and see if you could talk through the problems, almost like marriage counseling. This is what it's like. Do we both agree what the problem is? That would be my first piece of advice.
Okay. Okay, the next one is the biohealth tech startups. It takes a long time, normally. So his question is how he can persuade the investors to supporting this long period of time for the tech startups.
Biotech. Yeah. So biotech life sciences runs on a different clock speed. And for biotech, you could either be building therapeutics, that is drugs. You could be building medical devices, things that are implantable, or you could be building diagnostics, that is tests like a COVID test. Or you could be building some digital health product for hospitals or for consumers. The first three categories operate on a very different clock speed. And primarily because in the US and in Korea and other places, there's not only clinical trials you have to run, there's a whole regulatory regime. That is, people regulate therapeutics and devices and drugs in almost all countries. And so the long answer is, if you are talking to investors who don't understand that, shame on you. You're talking to the wrong investors, period. There are people who invest in this area, and they know a therapeutic takes 7-10 years to come to market. You might get bought or get big deals between now and then, or even go public before you have a drug, but you'll go through trials and you'll get more evidence, and etc. But seriously, to answer the question, you're talking to the wrong VCs. You need to talk to VCs whose entire website talks about funding life science companies. And if that's who you're getting the answers from, then they're trying to tell you something about your product, not that they don't get it. So one is you're either talking to the wrong class of VCs, or two is they're trying to tell you something about your product or service you haven't listened well enough to hear.
Okay. And we have a couple more questions in the YouTube. So the one question is does Lean Startup also talk about the team communications? Is it
So no, it does not. I talk a lot about that because that's essential to make a startup work. Is that a startup is a team doing an extreme activity with limited resources, and unless you synchronize and promote that type of teamwork and communication, it could very rapidly break down. And lots of people have written about team communication, but it's not the part of the lean startup process.
Okay, and somebody wants to know, could you tell me top 2 or top 3 team members that you met? They wanted to know
in my career?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
exactly. Yeah.
So this is kind of a funny side story, is that in my career, I was lucky to have a series of mentors, people who took interest in my career. and helped me get smarter, teaching me what to think about and how to think. They were all parts of my company, but they were extraordinary people. One was a guy named Gordon Bell, who was head of engineering of a company long gone, but an important company called Digital Equipment Corporation. Gordon became a real mentor to me and taught me, what to think about. Another one was my boss's boss, then my boss, then my co-founder, someone named Ben Wegbright. Well, Gordon taught me what to think about. Ben taught me how to think. Since I was all over the place, Ben knew how to just rifle shot thinking and cut through to a problem. And getting schooled from both these people were just incredibly important. I had another mentor who was someone named Rob Van Arden, who was probably the best enterprise salesperson I had run into early in my career. And most of the stuff I learned from Rob, I used for decades later. But these were people who took an interest in my career, and I didn't realize it at the time, is because when someone decides they want to mentor you, it's because you're actually giving them stuff back you didn't even know they were learning. And it's because I had a lot of ideas and whatever. In hindsight, they were getting smarter too, but I never realized that. And maybe they never realized that. But if someone the summary is, if someone takes an interest in your career, I would pay attention. And I would say they made me what I am today.
Okay. It's another one is it's like statistically almost 95% of the startup fails. And his question is, how can I be in the 5% in success?
Wait till the other 95% fail. So if you want to guarantee success, then you should join a large company. I think that's the wrong mindset. I think the mindset is, how do I increase the odds of success? Lean methodology is one, picking the right team members is another, being incredibly lucky or astute or figuring out what's going on in markets and time and technology. But being afraid to fail means you're not going to take the risks required to be a founder of a startup. Startups are essentially a risky business. Luckily in innovation clusters, whether it's Seoul or Silicon Valley, a failed entrepreneur is not considered a failure, they're considered experienced. If that's not true in your town or city, then you ought to leave and go to a place where it is. We get multiple shots at the goal. It's not just one time, and if you fail, then you'll never be able to do it again. That's not true. What's true is that you learn more things and you get to do it again and again. I did it 8 times. And I never wanted to fail, but I wasn't afraid to take risks. And so I hear the question, and I know it was a serious one, but I think that's looking through the telescope at the wrong end. You ought to figure out how to optimize your chances of success, but not be afraid to go take a shot at it. It's still hard to starve to death in Korea and the United States, especially if you're an entrepreneur. You'll be sleeping on someone's couch maybe, but you're not going to die. And if that's too frightening, guys, seriously, entrepreneurship and startups are not the norm. Normal people don't do this. Crazy people do this. People who want to make something that's stuck in their head real. If that's who you are, then this is the right thing to do. So that's my answer to like, how do I be the 5%?
Okay. And then I think that most of the startups are having a problem with their team members. There is another question, which is which type of people should we avoid to bring into the team?
Yeah, you know what? That's a different question. And I think that there's a difference between early employees and later employees. There's co-founders, then there are the early employees who join before you've generated revenue or even found product market fit, and then there are people who come later and later. You ought to make sure you're picking the right people for the right time. And that's a big idea. You know, in the early days when there's you and your co-founders, or you and co-founders and early employees, you actually want equally crazy people who are willing to take risk for maybe some type of big reward, maybe. But later on, people are joining for the salary or because it sounds like a cool company or whatever. And so you want to figure out, when do you want to hire what type of people and what type of risk profile do they have? That's my answer. And a lot of these mistakes are hiring. I made this mistake multiple times in my career, hiring world-class people way too early. They wanted comfort. They wanted written data sheets and presentations and price lists and process. And I was going, we're just making it up right now. And then their head exploded when they heard that. How can we work without, you know, a manual or without a price list or without? No, we'll discover it. Those are the people you want early on, who are comfortable in chaos and uncertainty. As the company gets more certain, as it discovers more things, finds a predictable pattern, then you could hire different types of people.
Okay, great answers. Okay, and since you have 8 companies, so this question is, how do you keep motivating your co-workers and the employees?
Well, you know, a startup is built on a vision, which is essentially turns into a mission, as you validated, is, you know, we want to change transportation, or we want to change boredom on the subway lines when we're commuting, or we want to change, you know, something, and we're going to do a great job at doing this. And, you know, do you want to join us on this journey? And if you remember, I said one of the key characteristics of a founder is the ability to communicate mission and passion and vision to others. If you can't do that, then you ought to be an employee or a co-founder or not the CEO. Your job is to paint a picture of something so compelling and so interesting that other people literally want to quit their jobs and leave and do that. And that's one of the skills of, it's what Steve Jobs used to call the reality distortion field. That is, making people believe when you have nothing that they can envision that outcome.
Okay. And the next one is, what are the main success factors for the development of the innovative startups?
Well, you're going to have to take the class for that. I'm going to pass on that. That's the whole semester. Seriously. I'm getting a little tired here.
I'm sorry. Okay. I mean, they are asking a lot of the questions which they wanted to know from you. Okay. And I mean, you teach a lot of the class in the Lean Launchpad in the many universities. So how to develop creativity and the innovation of the pupils and the students, entrepreneurs?
That's a great question. And I have to tell you a funny story, is that at Stanford, I ran into this woman named Tina Seelig, Seelig. And she teaches and wrote like 21 books on how to be creative. And I just laughed when I heard that. I went, how to be creative? Tina, my problem is figuring out which one of the 5,000 ideas I have, how to pick. What do you mean you have to teach creativity? And she politely told me, which I thought was very funny, is, Steve, you know, most people don't have your problem. They're trying to figure out how to come up with an idea, not sort out from a million ideas. And so Tina Seelig at Stanford teaches some great creativity classes. There are other people who teach that. I think creativity is the whole front end of entrepreneurship. That is, if it doesn't come naturally, and for most people it doesn't, but it doesn't mean you're not creative. It just means there are some skills you need to learn, and some people are better at it than others. But you could learn how to do this. There are books to read and classes to take. And again, Tina Seelig at Stanford was one of the best I've seen at it. And if you just look at the Stanford website and see some of her material and some of her books, I thought they were great. But I truly believe that's a great question, because creativity is the front end of entrepreneurship. And by the way, what goes with creativity is curiosity. I mean, I'm curious about everything still. Whether it's physics or biology or space travel or military. I mean, I'm constantly learning new things. And if you're not doing that, you're kind of missing something as an entrepreneur. You can't force it, but I have found that that's a pretty interesting correlation between successful entrepreneurs, is they have other interests as well besides their specific domain. And by the way, I just said this, and I should have mentioned it way earlier, because you were talking about the government and NSF and the rest. It took me a long time to realize that the inventor, the scientist, is almost never the entrepreneur. There are exceptions, but those are typically two different people. That is, there's someone who comes up with an idea or a technology invention or something else, but then there's someone who knows how to take that idea and actually turn a business into it. That's a different type of skill set than the invention. As I said, I've seen people in universities, sometimes lab managers have both skills, and more often than not in life sciences of all things. But understanding invention and entrepreneurship are not the same thing. They are both required for a company, but not the same.
I told her about that theory in my class all the time. The Nobel Prize winner never became a billionaire. Yeah.
Why is that? Right?
Okay. I think that since you're dealing with the many different kind of the technology and the business areas, I think maybe you can answer for this one. Which technology will determine the development of the civilization in the 21st centuries?
No idea. I pass.
Okay. And then we are still in the year in the pandemics. So I think how have the science and technology in the world been impacted by this COVID? What do you think?
Well, I think the thing that's blown me away is the rapid ability of therapeutics companies and diagnostics companies to master, mRNA and all the other technologies that we've used to both diagnose and vaccinate, and now maybe even have pills that cure, or at least get rid of hospitalization and certainly drive down the death rate. I just think people don't appreciate the amount of time it used to take to develop a vaccine for a disease was a decade or more, and we've gotten that down to a year or two. It's pretty amazing. That's the good news. The bad news is billions of people are now science experiments, but the good news is the rapid advance of biotech here for therapeutics and diagnostics has just been unbelievable. And I think while this worked against the virus, we might see it work against other diseases as well. And there are clinical trials and cancer trials for some other mRNA techniques. We'll see what happens. But I think that has blown us away. I think the other one is just what we're doing now. This notion of having what I'll consider good enough conferences over electronic media. I mean, this doesn't replace me being in a conference hall with you sitting in the seats, but I never would have traveled to Korea for a 2-hour conference. With all due respect to my esteemed moderator here. So I think the the notion of being able to connect electronically has been a kind of a things that people predicted for years, but it's moved it ahead by a decade or two. So I think those two things.
Okay. I think you give us a very nice your insight, and then especially you give us the lean launchpad and the lean startups and those things, the insight for us very nicely today. So I mean what if you come to the Korea, and what kind of the things you want to do in Korea? You haven't been in the 40 years, right? Yeah.
It's been 40 years since I've lived in Korea, and I know it's changed dramatically. Obviously, all parts of the world, but even Korea, maybe more so. You know, I got to see a good part of Korea by helicopter, and you know, I can't wait to get back. Someday I will come back and see the beautiful parts of Korea that I missed and also enjoyed. And you should know, in the States I still eat Korean food every once in a while because I miss it.
Okay. I will be visiting the United States the next month. So if I have a chance, I'll give you a call.
Yes, and bring some kimchi.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay, that's good. So as a last, I mean I have out of questions, and I think you spend a long time. I mean, I really appreciate your patience. Yeah. So
well, the questions were great, and the moderator was better. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. So if you give us the last advice to the entrepreneurs, to the Korea, yeah, what will it be?
You know, it's hard to imagine, but this is the best time in the history of capitalism and commerce to be an entrepreneur. The culture is now ready for you. You know, your country is ready for you. Risk capital, both private money and venture capital, is ready for you. They're just waiting for you to take the first step, to come up with the idea. And you know, if you're afraid to fail, you're going to be afraid to try. But the rewards are just enormous for both you, your community, your family, the country, and the world. So, you know, good luck to all of you, and hope you as the most famous entrepreneur and the next Elon Musk and Zuckerberg. So thanks.
Okay, Steve, I really appreciate today's your time and your effort. So I'm looking forward to see you soon. Okay, bye-bye, Steve.
See you soon.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. Okay, thanks. Today's the Professor Steve Blank's speech was, I think, I hope it will give you the insight about the startups, how to do the startups, and become a founders. And thank you very much. I'll see you later then. Bye.